Hey Matt, if you want to introduce the weirdo up here, that's cool.
Well, welcome to our once a month Calvary Chapel, Anne Arundel County Bible Prophecy Update. If you're in the coffee house and you have food, Pastor Ray always says that this is our living room and you're allowed to bring food into the living room. So come on in. If you have kids and you want to join us, there is childcare provided. And with that, you see on the screen what our topic is, and Paul's going to be doing that. Paul is usually our behind-the-scenes guy, but today he is up in front and visual, well, semi-visual. And he's going to be giving his lecture or update on what you see on the screen. And then after that, we're going to have a time of Q&A. And then after that, once he's done, the stream will go off, and then we'll have a time of Q&A, and then some roundtable discussion, and whatever's on your mind. And Paul and I are both willing to stay after we end for any other questions you might have. And without further ado.
All right, thank you very much. Today, we will be doing something a little bit different. Pastor Ray has asked us to do kind of a deeper analysis of sort of the eschatological implications of Marxism and globalism. So with that said, I would like to make everyone, first of all, aware of the disclaimer that I give everyone in our Bible studies, which is Acts 17:11, which is basically, don't believe anything that I tell you. I'm going to say a lot of stuff that's going to make people very uncomfortable. I'm going to say stuff that you probably haven't thought of before, that you probably haven't heard of before. That's fine. Don't believe anything that I say. Be like the Bereans. Search the scriptures daily and prove if these things are so. And because I'm also making sort of extensive use of outside sources, I will cite those where possible so that you can go find them yourself and make sure I'm not lying to you. Now, with that said, the march towards globalism and its many Marxist qualities is not something peculiar to the last 200 years or so. Rather, it has seen an acceleration in that amount of time, but it is not peculiar to our own time, and rather it traces itself all the way back to, quite frankly, the ruler of this world, which is Satan. Our contention is that the moves we see in this world today and all of their preceding moves are part of a larger end-time strategy formulated by Satan and his forces to destroy the nation of Israel and usurp permanent authority on the earth. To forward this strategy, it is first necessary to create the conditions for global governance with a technological base and world population most accepting of the one we call the Antichrist as Satan's personal representative on the earth. But as I said, these forces are nothing new, and indeed that is so, for everything that we now see began in Genesis chapter 3, when God declared war and ultimate victory over the serpent and his seed. Then, after the flood, and in defiance of God, men began to concentrate themselves into the city of Nimrod and built a great tower. This Nimrod was, for all practical purposes, the first world dictator. He was the founder of many cities, and he ruled a world in defiance of God. That's Genesis 10:8 for those of you that are interested. In one of his cities, Babel, later Babylon, we find men congregating and centering their lives around a tower for astrological and occultic practices. It is a misunderstanding to treat the Tower of Babel as a pathetic attempt by ignorant men to build a tower to reach into the sky. Rather, it was a tower, quote, with the heavens in its top. And when compared with what we know of the spread of false religion through the world, we can see the practices of that spread throughout the earth that are still with us today. And they all got their start in Babylon. For those interested in more on that topic, I recommend J.A. Seise's The Gospel in the Stars, E.W. Bullinger's The Witness of the Stars, and you might also consider Hislop's The Two Babylons, although for the final one, there are some technical issues with it, but nothing that detracts from the overall thesis. So what we have in Babel is essentially a model for everything that we will see in the last days. We see the world in political and ecclesiastical unity and in knowing defiance of God. We'll talk about that more later. It is a mistake to think that the forces of the world seek for a world without religion. Rather, they want a world that is full of religion, but that religion will be devoid of God. Now, the ideas within Marxism did not start with Marx. They have all been observed and tried many times throughout history. I quote here a single example from the dynasty of Jin and its sole ruler, Wang Mang, dated about 9 AD to 23 AD, between the former and the latter Han dynasties. Wang Mang was a fanatical Confucianist and believed that if Confucian principles were correctly implemented throughout China, then they would be able to have a superior state. Part of this process involved the aggregation of power and wealth for the redistribution to the people. He was well qualified for this task and went about it with the zeal of a true believer. And backed with the powerful Chinese bureaucracy and the Chinese belief in the mandate of heaven. However, he was deposed after years of chaos, famine, poverty, and general unrest, resulting in the reestablishment of the Han Dynasty. I quote now from John Key's China, A History. Quote, "At first, all had gone well. In a flurry of directives, slavery, though never that common, was abolished. The sale of land was forbidden. Orders were issued for the breakup and redistribution of large estates, and there was a move towards the restoration of the Zhao's idealized well-field system of peasant holdings, whereby 8 families held an equal area of land within a ditched grid, somewhat like the X's and O's graph, where the square in the middle was being held in common. These were brave initiatives aimed at redressing the inequalities and reinitialization of traditional economy based on self-sufficient peasantry. They ought to have won the approval of both present-minded historians and later social reformers. But in fact, between 20th century revolutionaries would be little tempted to rehabilitate Wang Meng. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, would deplore the Marxist construction that could be put on the egalitarian well-field system. The Marxists were equally uncomfortable with it because of its, quote, feudal character. His 4 reformations of the coinage, his 5 equalizations designed to stabilize prices and provide rural credit, and his 6 monopolies may have been well-intentioned. Although state monopolies had never been a Confucian target, all the measures could be seen as discouraging speculative enterprise in favor of honest small-scale farming, the bedrock of Confucian economics. But in practice, they caused chaos and distress." End quote. This is just a single example of many that we could pull from to show the long and inglorious history of Marxist ideology throughout the world, both ancient and modern. But returning now to Europe and its quest for political and religious unification, we find one such attempt to reforge Rome after the dissolving at the hands of barbarians. This first form was the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted some 1,000 years and was a marriage between the Pope, the successor in many ways to the Roman emperors when the empire broke apart, and the Central European tribes under the command of Charlemagne. However, it never had the true power and importance of Rome and was often in a state of chaos, particularly in the latter years. This eventually prompted Voltaire to aptly note that it was, quote, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Later, Napoleon and the French Empire came to the forefront of continental power. Napoleon was a skilled general and administrator, and it was under his leadership that France came out of the chaos that consumed it after the fall of the previous aristocracy. He, too, attempted a unification of Europe for political and economic reasons and came close, but his Pyrrhic victory at Moscow and later defeat at Waterloo ensured that the French Empire would never again rise to its former glory. It was at this time and in this atmosphere that Europe began a technological revolution with broad-ranging consequences, both for her and the world at large. The Industrial Revolution had a series of impacts which broke the previous social orders. The ability for mass production created economic opportunity that was previously unavailable. Yet at the same time, the investment capital and organization required for the effective manufacturing and product distribution remained high. This created a shift in the balance of power among the classes of Europe and put it in the hands of the merchant class and financiers away from the historic aristocracies. Not to mention the sociological rending from masses of people concentrated in cities around manufacturing and production where traditional family structure and social life resided in the countryside. Within this climate, Marx stepped in with a new plan for dealing with the social and economic problems of Europe. What then is the ideology of Marx and his system in general? The intent of Marxism is an even or at least centrally managed, planned, and controlled economic system for the distribution of wealth, goods, services, and so on, such that instead of natural market forces controlled by a population or old aristocracies, these instead become centralized in the hands of a new ruling class. There are, however, some natural consequences to this politico-economic theory. Humanism, universality, power centralization, and the state as the highest authority. First, Marxism is a humanist government and economic system, i.e., it believes that man, ultimately, under the correct conditions, can obtain universal peace, equality, and understanding. Not only is this a direct contradiction of the Word of God, but it goes against the basic principles of history and human nature. God declared that the heart is evil and desperately wicked, Jeremiah 17:9, and that our righteousness is as filthy rags, that's Isaiah 64:6. At no point in Scripture are we told that by our own power or will, we will be able to overcome sin in ourselves or in the world at large. This can only be done by Christ. All other attempts are useless. History bears this out. In all the ages of man, in all the government systems that he has devised, in all of his inventions, cleverness, and his psychological manipulations, in all of his systems and means, he has never been able to truly defeat the evil and sin within himself. Every system has been tried. As Solomon so wisely said, there is nothing new under the sun, not even communism, as we have already demonstrated. Even the utopian experiments of Dr. Calhoun demonstrate that, contrary to popular misconception, the creation of a perfect society will not lead to a brighter future, but instead the death of the species as a whole. The second facet of Marxism is necessarily a universal system, and those that do not conform to its image must be converted or eliminated. I provide a single example from L'Internationale, which is the anthem of communism, to demonstrate the first two ideological facets here. Here quoted as the English translation from the original French. Quote, "Stand up, damned of the earth, stand up, prisoners of starvation. Reason thunders in its volcanoes. This is the eruption of the end. Of the past let us make a clean slate. Enslaved masses, stand up, stand up. The world is about to change its foundation. We are nothing, let us be all. There are no supreme saviors, neither God, nor Caesar, nor tribune. Producers, let us save ourselves, decree the common salvation. So the thief expires, so the spirit be pulled from its prison. Let us fan the forge ourselves, strike the iron while it is hot. Workers, peasants, we are, the great party of the workers. The earth belongs only to men. The idol will go to reside elsewhere. How much of our flesh have they consumed? But if these ravens, these vultures disappear from these days, the sun will shine forever." End quote. The necessary consequence of this universal system, which aggregates power and capital away from the masses, is that everyone must ultimately agree with and support it. For within communism, there is an inherent need for uniformity. For if capital is aggregated within the hands of an elite few, the government to then redistribute, spend, and invest it, there must at some level be agreement not only on the direction of the funds, but with the general mechanism by which said distribution occurs. This is in contrast to other forms wherein the individual has, to a greater or a lesser extent, some control over these forces. Now, within any sufficiently large collection of people, there will invariably be difference of opinion on anything. The natural consequence of this is that for communism to work, there must be a change in the thinking, the ideology, and even the values such that they align with the state and its mandates, up to and including the redefinition of words by means of dialogue control, as happened within the Soviet Union. For those interested in the various propaganda and control measures within the former Soviet Union and Marxism at large, I recommend Alexei Yurchek's "Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, The Last Soviet Generation." The final ideological tenet of Marxism is that religion is the opiate of the masses. Marxism is vehemently opposed to religion, as we have already seen, for it is within religion that man has outside guidance and a higher authority away from the constraints of a government or ruling power. As we have already stated, any system or ideological tenets which fall outside the realm of official mandate cause friction within the communist system. Thus, religion can be of the utmost threat to a fundamentally humanist system which must control all ideological dialogue and progress. Not only does religion offer an outside voice and thought pattern from the individual and nation, but it also derives its authority from deity. However, as opposed to religion, as communism often is, that does not mean it is not willing to use it or the guise of it to suit its own purposes. It has historically been a common practice of Marxism to infiltrate large religious organizations with communist agents and sympathizers for the purpose of undermining the tenets of that religion or altering them to serve the goals of the state, most notably within the Russian Orthodox Church and the World Council of Churches. For those of you that are interested more on that, I recommend an analysis of the Matrokin Archive, which is quite fascinating. It is important to remember this when we consider the marriage between the state and those under the guise of religion. One of the common misconceptions among many studying the end times is to assume that there is a pervasive atheism within the world. This is not the case. There is religion, but it is a corrupt and perverse version of the names and the forms of those things given by God. It has all of those names, but none of the substance. Understand that one of the greatest traps of Satan is not to destroy the church, but to subvert it, to pollute it, and to blind those inside of it. It has been this way since at least the days of Constantine. Continuing our story, however, in 1917, the world got its first taste of a Marxist system in practical action. In an attempt to halt the two-front war Germany had been fighting in the First World War, German planners concocted a very interesting plan. They needed to remove either the Western Front or the Eastern Front and concentrate her forces into a single massive offensive in the spring of 1918. As such, they chose a creative asymmetric action to stop the war in the East. German officials contacted Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin, who was at that time living in exile in Switzerland, and made an arrangement. If sent back to Russia, he would act as a dissident, and upon achieving power, there would be a treaty to end the war on the Eastern Front. Lenin accepted and was placed on a sealed train car bound for Russia. That's the train car right there for those of you that are interested. Meanwhile, the Romanov dynasty was falling apart due to mismanagement and numerous losses during the war. And even though the Russian people still loved and revered the emperor and his family, the dynasty fell and power transferred to the Duma, which was the Russian legislature at the time. But the Duma was weak, and the resulting power vacuum saw Lenin and his followers able to seize power in the famous October Revolution. To his credit, Lenin kept his word, and the resulting Treaty of Brest-Litovsk effectively ended the war with Germany. For their part, the Bolsheviks believed that such a treaty was largely irrelevant because, with their recent successes in Russia, it was thought that a worldwide Marxist revolution was at hand and that all such aggregations or treaties would be outdated in the coming utopia. They were only half right. However, all of this, there was a strange mutation in the Marxist genes, one which is seldom recognized today, and that is the mutation of fascism. Many people believe that fascism is the extreme opposite of Marxism. This is not the case. Instead of digressing into a long sort of discussion of political theory, I will simply allow the writers and thinkers of that time to use their own words. I quote now from The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich von Hayek. Quote, "Similarly, a British writer, Mr. F.A. Voigt, after many years of close observation of developments of Europe as a foreign correspondent, concludes, Marxism has led to fascism and National Socialism, because in all essentials, it is fascism and National Socialism. And Dr. Walter Lippmann has arrived at the same conviction that the generation to which we belong is now learning from experience what happens when men retreat from freedom to a coercive organization of their affairs. Though they promise themselves an abundant life, they must in practice renounce it. As the organized direction increases, the variety of ends must give way to uniformity. That is the nemesis of the planned society and the authoritarian principle in human affairs." We shall quote as one more example a German writer who expresses the same conclusions, perhaps more justly than those already quoted. Quote, "The complete collapse of the belief in the ability of freedom and equality through Marxism," writes Mr. Peter Drucker, "has forced Russia to travel the same road towards a totalitarian, purely negative, non-economic society of unfreedom and inequality which Germany has been following. Not that communism and fascism are essentially the same. Fascism is the stage reached after communism has proved an illusion. It has proved much an illusion in the Stalinist Russia as in pre-Hitler Germany." That is quoted specifically from the Social Research Journal, Volume 8, Number 4, November 1941. It deserves to be recalled in this connection that whatever his reasons may have been, Hitler thought it expedient to declare to the public in his speeches as late as February of 1941, quote, "Basically, socialism and Marxism are the same." So basically, National Socialism and Marxism are the same. Now, we have so far been quite hard on the Marxists of the world, and I believe that criticism is justified. Yet similar criticisms can rightly be laid at the feet of the capitalist as well. The commoditization of all facets of life, including people and mass media, in the search for greater and grander spectacles of wealth and the worship of the almighty American dollar, the unleashing of the monstrous greed in the name of economic betterment, the intense pressures for success that drive some to madness and others to despair. These phenomena, while not peculiar to capitalism, are part of it and are accentuated by it. I believe the problem and the solution was best put by Dr. Charles Malik, president of the UN General Assembly, Greek Orthodox theologian and philosopher, and according to Dr. J. Vernon McGee, a true honest-to-goodness believer. Quote, "I'm not sure your Western materialism is better than the Soviets. If I were asked to choose between the dialectic materialism of the Soviets and the materialistic outlook of life practiced by the commercialism of the West, I'm not sure I would choose the Western brand of materialism at all. Every time I listen to an important radio broadcast, which is repeatedly interrupted by an advertisement for some shoe polish or laxative or brand of marmalade, I have to say 2 or 3 prayers in order to remain human. Another sign of weakness, Christians are not speaking with conviction. Many Christians here have become so worldly that one doubts whether their Christianity can resist the non-Christian and anti-Christian pressures. I could recite 20 or more signs of moral weakness in the Western world, which are highly disturbing. Weaknesses of people who ought to know better, people with a great tradition behind them, whose tradition alone can save them and the world 10 times over if they understand it and live it and rise above their failures." End quote. Well, having now discussed the origins and character of Marxism and globalism, it is best to continue our analysis in the post-war era, for this is where we see a dramatic acceleration of events. The following is broken into two sections. First, an analysis of Europe and the rise of the superstate known as the European Union, and the second will be an analysis of globalism, its adherents, tenets, ideologies, and background forces with a focus on the United States. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe lay in shambles. The Soviet Union established a large foothold on the continent, and with Operation Unthinkable off the table, which was the Allied plan to preemptively strike the Soviet Union in the wake of the German defeat, an iron calm eventually settled over Europe. In the East, there was the Soviet bloc, and in the West, there was NATO. Many realized that the war that took place could never be allowed to happen again, and for that to happen, there must be a united Europe. Which was something that the intellectuals and political leaders of Europe had dreamed of for a very long time. Yet the long historical divides ran deep, too deep to traverse via traditional means. But money talks, and it was realized that the only way to unite Europe politically was to first unite it commercially. The unification can be told through the lens of three treaties: the Treaty of Paris in 1951, the Treaty of Rome in 1957, and the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. All of this was preceded by and predicated upon the Sherman Declaration, a speech given by Robert Sherman, the French Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs, on May 9, 1950. These aims were to mark the birth of a united Europe, make war between member states impossible, encourage world peace, transform Europe in a, quote, step-by-step process leading to the unification of Europe democratically, unifying two political blocs separated by the Iron Curtain, creation of the world's first supranational institution, to create the world's first international anti-cartel agency, to create a common market for the European community. It would, starting with the coal and steel sector, revitalize the whole European economy by a similar community process. And finally, it would improve the world economy and the developing countries, such as those in Africa. The Treaty of Paris was the first step in the commercial unification and the creation of the European coal and steel community, and was signed by Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The general intent was the unification of the coal and steel community in Europe to act as the foundation and the blueprint for everything that was to follow. It proved wildly successful. In the wake of the Treaty of Paris, the next milestone of European unification was the Treaty of Rome, signed March of 1957. The same nations that signed the Treaty of Paris now created two more pan-European consortiums, the European Atomic Energy Agency and the European Economic Community. The EEC was created to erect a tariff wall around member states and remove international tariffs, a concept which persists to this day in the expanded European Union. The Treaty of Rome also established a European Parliament, one of the main legislative bodies across Europe. Then, in 1967, the merging continued with the creation of the European Community, and by 1986, a total of 12 European nations made up that community. The next milestone for Europe occurred in June of 1993 with the Maastricht Treaty, named after the city in which it was signed, of Maastricht, Netherlands. The intent of the treaty was the creation of a commercial, common currency, judiciary, foreign policy, and military. In a series of interviews with those involved, quote, "It became quite evident that the behind-the-scenes machinations to finesse the votes within each country to approve the Maastricht Treaty was highly organized by the international socialists and their proponents," end quote. At this point, most of us likely know the story of the progression of Europe to the present. The European Union is a powerful geopolitical and economic entity with eschatological implications yet to be seen, though clearly on the horizon as detailed in passages such as Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. But turning back to our own shores, it is worth tracing the rise of globalism and the requisite decline of the United States, for those two go hand in hand, because to create a global system, one must reduce or abolish the nation state, and the United States, as one of the premier nation states after the Second World War, thus became the primary logical target. I am indebted to the work of Dr. Cuddy for the following research. What follows is a series of quotes, though I could have included many, many more, that will go to show the calculated and systematic march of globalism in the American decline. We're going to start our story in 1912 with Colonel Edward M. House, a close advisor of President Woodrow Wilson, who publishes Philip Drew, Administrator, in which he promotes, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Marx. In 1913, prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, President Wilson's The New Freedom was published, in which he revealed the following, quote, since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided in me privately, some of the biggest men in the U.S. in the field of commerce and manufacturing. They are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. December 15th, 1922, the Council of Foreign Relations endorses world government in its magazine Foreign Affairs. Author Philip Kerr states, quote, obviously, there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind as long as the earth remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states until some kind of international system is created. The real problem today is that of world government. 1931, students at the Lenin School for Political Warfare in Moscow are taught, quote, one day we will start to spread the most theatrical peace movement the world has ever seen. The capitalist countries, stupid and decadent, will fall into the trap offered by the possibility of making new friends. Our day will come in 30 years or so. The bourgeoisie must be lulled into a false sense of security. On November 21st, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote a letter to Colonel Edward Mandell House, President Wilson's close advisor. Quote, the real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson. 1932, Plans for Peace is published by American Birth Control League founder Margaret Sanger, is published, in which she calls for the coercive sterilization, mandatory segregation, and rehabilitation concentration camps for all, quote, dysgenic stocks, which includes blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, and Catholics. 1934, Externalizations of the Hierarchy is published by Alice A. Bailey. Bailey was an occultist whose works are channeled from their spirit guide, the Tibetan master, i.e. the demon spirit, Dijwald Kool. Bailey used the phrase points of light in connection with, quote, a new group of world servers, and claims that by 1934 would mark the beginning of a new organization of men and women, a group of workers for a new order, with progress defined by service and the world of the brotherhood of the forces of light, and that out of this spoilization of all existing culture and civilization, a new world order must be built. This book was originally published by the Lucius Trust, Incorporated in New York, as the Lucifer Publishing Company. The Lucius Trust, incidentally, is a United Nations non-governmental organization and has been a major player at many UN summits. Later, Assistant Secretary of the UN, Robert Mueller, would credit the creation of his World Core curriculum for education on the underlying teachings taught by Dijwald Kool via Alice Bailey's writings on the subject. 1942, the Institute for Pacific Relations publishes Post-War World by P.E. Colbert. Quote, world government is the ultimate aim. It must be recognized that the law of nations takes precedent over national law. The process will have to be assisted by the deletion of the nationalistic material employed in educational textbooks and its replacement by material explaining the benefits of wiser association. 1946, The Teacher and World Government is published by former editor of the National Educational Association journal, Joy Elmer Morgan. He says, quote, in the struggle to establish an adequate world government, the teacher can do much to prepare the hearts and minds of children for global understanding and cooperation. At the very heart of all these agencies which will ensure the coming of world government must stand the school, the teacher, and the organized profession. 1948, UNESCO president and Fabian socialist Sir Julian Huxley calls for a radical eugenics policy in UNESCO, its purpose and its philosophy. He states, quote, thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenics policy of controlled human breeding will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, that much of what is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable. End quote. February 9th, 1950, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee introduces Senate Concordant Resolution 66, which begins, quote, whereas, in order to achieve universal peace and justice, the present Charter of the United Nations should be changed to provide a true world government constitution. 1964, Taxonomy of Education Objectives Handbook 2 is published. Author Benjamin Bloom states, quote, "A large part of what we call good teaching is the teacher's ability to attain effective objectives through challenging the student's fixed beliefs," end quote. His outcome-based education method of teaching would first be tried as mastery learning in Chicago schools. After 5 years, Chicago students' test scores plummeted, causing outrage among parents. It would later leave a trail of wreckage wherever it was tried and under whatever name it was used. At the same time, it would become crucial to globalists for overhauling the educational systems and promote the attitude changes necessary in public schools. 1966, Professor Carroll Quigley published his book, Tragedy and Hope, which Bill Clinton very much admired. He states, quote, "There does exist and has existed for a generation an international network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or to any other group and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for some 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough that it should be known," end quote. And from the same manuscript, we have this other quote. "The powers of the financial capitalism and other far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank, in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, and Hjalmar Schlatt of the Reichsbank, sought to dominate the government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world," end quote. 1970, education and the mass media promote New World Order. In Thinking About a New World Order for the Decade 1990, author Ian Baldwin Jr. asserts that, quote, "The World Law Fund has begun a worldwide research and education program that will introduce a new emerging discipline, world order, into the educational curricula throughout the world, and to concentrate some of its energies on bringing basic world order concepts into the mass media again on a worldwide level." 1973, the Humanist Manifesto 2 is published, where it states, quote, "The next century can be and should be a humanistic century. We stand at the dawn of a new age, a secular society on a planetary scale. As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. We deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. Thus, we look to the development of a system of a world law and world order based upon transnational federal government. The true revolution is occurring," end quote. 1975, in Congress, 32 senators and 92 representatives signed the Declaration of Interdependence, written by historian Henry Steele Commanger. The declaration states, quote, "We must join with others to bring forth a new world order. Narrow notions of national sovereignty must not be permitted to curtail the obligations." Congresswoman Marjorie Holt refused to sign the declaration, stating, quote, "It calls for the surrender of our national sovereignty to international organizations. It declares that our economy should be regulated by international authorities. It proposes that we enter a new world order that would redistribute the wealth created by the American people." 1975, Kissinger on the Couch is published, and authors Phyllis Schlafly, who is a former Council Foreign Relations member, and Chester Ward state, quote, "Once the ruling members of the CFR have decided that the U.S. government should espouse a particular policy, the very substantial research facilities of the CFR are put to work to develop arguments, intellectual and emotional, to support the new policy and to confound, discredit, intellectually and politically, any opposition." 1979, Barry Goldwater, retiring Republican senator from Arizona, publishes his autobiography with no apologies. He writes, quote, In my view, the Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the four centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. All this is to be done in the interest of creating a more peaceful, more productive world economy. What the Trilateralists truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political governments of the nation-states involved. They believe that the abundant materialism they propose to create will overwhelm the existing differences. As managers and creators of the system, they will rule the future. 1987, The Secret Constitution and the Need for Constitutional Change is sponsored in part by the Rockefeller Foundation. Some thoughts of its chief author, Arthur S. Miller, are, quote, "A pervasive system of thought control exists in the United States. The citizenry is indoctrinated by employment of the mass media and a system of public education. People are told what to think about. The old order is crumbling. Nationalism should be seen as a dangerous social disease. A new vision is required to plan and manage the future. A global vision will be transcending national boundaries and eliminate the poison of nationalistic solutions. A new constitution is necessary." 1989, Carl Bernstein, in his book Loyalties, A Son's Memoir, is published. His father and mother were members of the Communist Party. Bernstein's father tells his son about the book, quote, "You're going to prove that Senator McCarthy was right, because all you're saying is that the system was loaded with communists, and he was right. I'm worried about what kind of book you're going to write and about cleaning up McCarthy. The problem is that everyone said he was a liar, and you're saying that he was right. I agree with you that the party was a force in the country." 1991, President Bush praises New World Order in the State of the Union message. This is the State of the Union message in 1991. Quote, "What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind based on shared principles and the rule of law, the illumination of 1,000 points of light. The winds of change are with us now." 1993, Strobe Talbot receives the Norman Cousins Global Governance Award for his 1992 Time article, The Birth of the Global Nation, and his appreciation for what he has done, quote, "for the cause of global governance." President Clinton wrote a letter of congratulations to him in which he states, "Norman Cousins worked for world peace and world government. Strobe Talbot's lifetime achievements as a voice for global harmony have earned him this recognition. He will be a worthy recipient of the Norman Cousins Global Governance Award. Best wishes for future success." End quote. Not only did President Clinton use the specific term world government, but he also expressly wished for its future success in pursuing world government. Talbot proudly accepted the award, but said that it should have gone to a more worthy recipient, which was the other nominee, Mikhail Gorbachev. May 4th, 1993, the Council of Foreign Relations President Leslie Gelb said on the Charlie Rose Show, quote, "You, Charlie, had me on before to talk about the New World Order. I talk about it all the time. It's one world now. The Council of Foreign Relations can find, nurture, and begin to put people in the kinds of jobs this country needs, and that's going to be one of my major enterprises on the Council under me." End quote. So, to summarize, the march towards globalism is, on the surface, an attempt to unite the world in peace by the removal of national barriers that promote war, the control of population, and other factors leading to unsustainable exponentialities within the larger world system, and the economic control and concentration of capital for planned projects and resource distribution on a global scale without pointless competition or waste which prevents man from achieving all he can. This march has happened regardless of political affiliation and from all corners of the globe, and yet all acts have been directed toward the same singular end. Just as the problems of capital go beyond economic systems, so too do the problems of global government go beyond political affiliations. There is something more going on. But then, what actually is the goal in all of this? What is the end game for Satan? Satan can thus marshal his forces at that time and place for what he supposes to be an ultimate showdown, i.e. the Mount of Olives 3.5 years after the beast declares himself to be God in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. So, what does that mean for us? First, recall that we are not to be ignorant of the times or the seasons around us. That's Matthew 24. While we may not know the day or the hour of his return, we do know the signs and the seasons around us. While there has always been a generation of believers that knew Christ could return at any moment, it is only in the post-war era that all of the pieces are in place for all of these prophecies in Scripture to be literally fulfilled. Israel is back in the land and was born in a day, as given by Isaiah 66:8 and Ezekiel 37. Technology has progressed to allow for the instant transmission of images around the world, as spoken of in Revelation 19:9, and the weapons at our disposal mirror those in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And we see the accelerated process of a larger global system, which aligns with those spoken of in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Revelation 17 and 18. Second, this should act as a reminder that the true battle is a spiritual one, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. We may look at the world around us and bemoan its condition, cry out for the sin in it and for the lost souls that march blissfully into damnation. But we must recall that it is not by some policy, political movement, or even by some grand agenda that we will solve the world's problems. Rather, it is by prayer and the power of God. For the problem is a sin problem, and anything of the flesh cannot solve this. It is only with the Spirit that there is any hope and progress, because it is only with God that he can purge our sins from us. No, the battle is won in prayer, and we deceive ourselves when we first step out for physical action without the first leading of the Spirit. Third, it is a reminder that we have a little time left and that we should run the race well. Recall what we are told in Ephesians 5:16, to redeem the time, for the days are evil. I do not need to tell you of the evil in this world. You know this all too well. Instead, we should think of this as motivation to ensure that we are doing all we can for God in our walk, in our life, and with our families. Whatever our ministry is, and with whatever gifts God has given to us, do all for him. For we shall soon appear before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the rewards for our life and determine their character. I, for one, do not want all of this to be for nothing. We all want our toil to have something behind it, to have some meaning. Let us then examine ourselves and see if what we are doing for him is by him and by his direction, or if it is for some other reason and for our own direction. It would be a horrible thing to have a lifetime of work